I am actually a listener of both your podcasts, and it's great content. If anybody is interested in listening to Aaron or Emerson's content and they're not already familiar, just scroll down on whatever podcast feed you're listening to this on, even if it's YouTube. You'll find their content links in today's show notes. Could one of you kind of give me an idea of what panpsychism is?
Yeah, that sounds like an Emerson question.
Okay, yeah. So panpsychism is the view that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous throughout the natural world. And by consciousness, I just mean Thomas Nagle's famous definition from his essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? So the fact that it's like something to be right now, the fact that it's like something to see color or to feel a sensation on your head, or, just the what it is likeness of experience is kind of what I mean by consciousness. And panpsychists believe that there is no matter for which it's not like something to be. So there's no such thing as just, non-experiential reality.
Yeah, like it's not like something to be a chair in the same way that it's like something to be your dog. Would that be a good way to kind of frame this, bracket it, so that people can understand that you're not just talking about craziness here. You're saying like, no, there are levels of consciousness that we can kind of imagine. We can't actually access it, but we can imagine what it would be like.
Yeah, and panpsychists don't believe everything is conscious in the same exact way, or that because people tend to anthropomorphize consciousness or mean a lot more by it than what I mean by it. So, they mean like self-consciousness or some kind of, like high-level cognitive capacity, or even like free will or something. Yeah, that's not what we're talking about. And even on panpsychism, it's not like something to be a chair in the same way it's like something to be you. It's just the constituent parts of the chair, our experience involving.
So, yeah, and I think I generally agree with this account, but I have a little concern. I will sort of asterisk a concern that we'll get to, that I'm not sure if on the panpsychist view we can really say there isn't something it's like to be a chair in some kind of way that is relevantly similar to what it's like to be a bat. But I do think the really important thing here that you're pointing out very well is, we're not talking about consciousness in the sense of intelligence or rationality. Those are not the concerns at issue in the hard problem. What we care about is phenomenal consciousness or sentience or subjectivity, or what it's like to be-ness, are different ways that this experience gets cashed out. But it's this part of this thing that we're all pretty convinced we're experiencing all the time, or a lot of us are convinced we're experiencing all of the time, but which doesn't seem to fit neatly into the physicalist, materialist world that science seems to be telling us about.
One of my patrons, Tara, is the person that kind of reached out and said, you really need to start talking about panpsychism. And this coincided with Sam Harris kind of delving into this topic. He had his wife on many of his recent podcasts talking about consciousness. So the two things kind of chimed up at a similar time, and it made me really find it just fascinating. And then when I started researching it, I was instantly disappointed, because I felt like this is just a lot of the same kind of language that I hear from spiritualism or religiosity. Maybe my short, just Google searches over the last couple of weeks isn't really a applicable understanding, a fair understanding of a very in-depth concept.
I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because there are definitely crazy panpsychists out there, but as far as I can tell, the kind of new agey spiritualist ones are in the minority. And they're sort of just not even in the same group as almost all the panpsychists that I know about, who are fellow atheists and naturalists and, former materialists who basically just made slight modifications to materialism to try to make up for some of its deficiencies. And to be clear, I'm talking about materialism in the specific context of philosophy of mind. I'm still a materialist in the sense that I think I'm made of nothing but matter. I think there's nothing but atoms up here in my skull. But in the context of philosophy of mind, materialist takes on a slightly different connotation. But yeah, I'm an atheist and a naturalist. I don't believe in any supernatural or any gods. And I think virtually every prominent panpsychist I can name is also an atheist. But yeah, there's this fringe of new age weirdos who are attracted to panpsychism, probably just because of the name.
It does sound cool.
I would also add like Spinoza, right? Even though he uses the term God or nature, can best be understood as sort of radically non-theistic in his very famous panpsychist pantheism. But that's sort of a very complicated, I guess, hermeneutic kind of question. But so I want to add to your question that I think there are different ways that panpsychism gets argued for, and some are better than others. So sometimes it is like an appeal to ignorance kind of fallacy, I think, that people will make. Other times it's more of a presuppositionalist kind of argument where it's like, based on what we know of the world, it seems like this necessarily has to be the case, even if we don't fully understand what it means or how it is the case. And that's not a bad way to argue. We argue for the existence of a lot of things in that kind of way. And I think what I would say is the most generous critical reading of panpsychism is that it gives one attempt to answer an intractable, hard problem for which I don't think there is a perfect answer, and it brings with it various sort of advantages and disadvantages. And the most critical thing I would say is that I don't think it gives a very useful or actionable answer to the nature of sentience and where it exists in the universe.
Let me play you guys interview with Philip Goff, and I want to get your take on what he says.
You argue that consciousness could in fact be a fundamental feature of reality, which is, of course, a form of panpsychism. So could you talk a bit more about this form of panpsychism that you defend?
Yeah, so the particular form I'm attracted to, and in fact, I mean, the reason why panpsychism that used to be laughed at for so long, insofar as it was thought about at all, is now getting taken much more seriously in academic philosophy, is largely due to the rediscovery of really, really important work from the 1920s by the philosopher and Nobel laureate Bertrand Russell and the great scientist Arthur Eddington, who was incidentally the first scientist to experimentally confirm general relativity after the First World War. But I'm inclined to think these guys did in the 1920s for the science of consciousness what Darwin did in the 19th century for the science of life. And I think it's a tragedy of history that for various historical reasons it got forgotten about. But it's in the last 10 or 15 years, it's getting rediscovered in academic philosophy and is causing a lot of excitement.
So let me ask you guys, is this something legitimate? Is this something that's been kind of current throughout philosophy all along and we just haven't noticed it?
Oh, yeah, completely. Oh, do you want to go first, Aaron?
I was going to say even though I oppose your position, I absolutely think it is a legitimate one. But yeah, you go ahead and say a little bit more about maybe the history of panpsychism.
Well, yeah, I mean, panpsychism has been a part of, mainstream Western philosophy pretty much throughout up until maybe the latter half of the 20th century, and it just kind of dipped out of sight for a while. But it was still there, like Thomas Nagle was writing about it, Galen Strawson. But yeah, I mean, some like Aaron mentioned Spinoza, like Leibniz as well. I'm trying to think of other William James, just a lot of Schopenhauer. Like there have been a lot of panpsychists in the mainstream like Western canon. Yeah, and like
you could argue that Berkeley was a panpsychist in his idealism.
There are some notable differences between Berkeley's idealism.
He is attempting, I would say, at least to address the same problem, the same mind-body problem that we are addressing here, and that he leans more towards that kind of universal mind than the opposite.
As for Russell and Eddington, though, that is totally legitimate what they were saying. Like the Russell Eddington thesis has a lot to do with the role of science and the kind of knowledge it gives us, and our epistemological starting point. So those are kind of the two crucial points that I hear Goff hit all the time. The first one would be, like I said, the epistemological starting point. So if you agree with Sam Harris, which I mean, a million people have said this, but he said it pretty concisely, which is just consciousness is the one thing that can't be an illusion. Most people agree with that. It's kind of just like, Cartesian skepticism kind of insight. Like most people will agree that the only thing that you know with absolute certainty is that you're conscious. Some people have tried to deny that, but I agree with Galen Strawson that that's the silliest claim that's ever been seriously made. And I think that it's where materialism and philosophy of mind bottoms out logically. So, I think Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish are a little more, maybe clever and consistent. And I think that they are following materialism to its logical conclusion. It kind of reminds me of John Locke's The Fool and the Madman. the fool can't see the implications of the premises he's accepted, and the madman does and is, crazy enough to accept them. Whereas, I think if our worldview requires us to deny the one thing that can't be an illusion, then I would say we've gone wrong somewhere, and maybe we should take a step or two back and figure out where we went wrong. But sorry, I got off track a little. If you believe that consciousness is the one thing that can't be an illusion, and you believe, like me, that you're made of matter and nothing else, then that tells you something about the nature of matter. It tells you that your epistemological starting point is that the only thing we know about the intrinsic nature of matter, or the nature of matter, is that it's sometimes conscious. So, the point being that the burden is on the person who wants to say there is such a thing as non-conscious matter. And I'm not saying that that can't be done. I'm just saying it has to be done. And the reasons, when you start to dig into it, like I'll probably ask you at some point, like, why do you believe that there's non-experiential matter? What is your evidence? Why do you have reason to believe in such a thing? And I think the reasons are shockingly inadequate. It's pretty much just prejudice. Like, it's based on our theory of mind and our intuitions. We've all kind of implicitly accepted Descartes' conception of matter. Everyone thinks that Descartes lost because we're not substance dualists, but his conception of matter is the one that everyone just accepts uncritically, which is that it's, like his, what I'm talking about, his like substance dualism, like there's this non-conscious matter, and then there's mind that interacts with it somehow. But, we all accept, kind of implicitly Descartes' conception of matter. So, that's the first point about Russell Eddington, which is that is our epistemological starting point, is that matter is, sometimes physical goings on are just conscious goings on. And the burden is on anyone who wants to say that there's, that we're kind of not continuous with nature in that way. And the other point, which I'll just wrap it up because I've been going on for a minute here, is just that science doesn't tell you as much as you think it does about the nature of matter. People think that, like, well, I can't believe that, that it's like something to be an atom or an electron, because physics says that it's not. Like physics gives us reason to accept Descartes' conception of matter. But that's just a flat out mistake. Like, you've kind of misunderstood what science is telling you. This is what Strawson, I think, going off of Russell, calls the silence of physics, which is that physics tells you what matter does and how it behaves, and like how you can manipulate it or something. Like, it gives you structural, relational information about what the matter is doing. And, consistent materialists like Sean Carroll will say, once you've described everything that the matter is doing, you've explained everything that the matter is. But that's because he's trying to be a consistent materialist. But the point is, that's all science can actually tell you, is what matter is doing. It can't tell you what matter is, if there is an intrinsic nature beyond what it's doing, which I would say there is. But so physics just doesn't tell you anything one way or the other about whether or not matter is conscious. It's completely silent on the issue. So that was, Russell and Eddington's insights were just that this radical realignment of our epistemological starting point. Because normally we think, well, obviously we know there's non-conscious matter, and then it somehow impossibly magically emerges into experiential matter. And they're saying, well, you kind of have that backwards. And also just that science doesn't tell you what matter actually is. It just can tell you what it's going to do. It's kind of like, the behaviorists in psychology. They don't, they just look at the behavior. They don't really think about any intrinsic experiential nature. But anyway, thank you for giving me all that time there.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of useful things that you've laid out there. I don't agree with every part of it, but I think I agree with the sort of table setting side of all of this, which is, going back to Robert's question about, is panpsychism a plausible position? I think, in the competing field of plausible explanations, I do think I would rank it above the illusionist position that you mentioned with Dennett and Frankish, because I think, bless them, I think if they're being truly consistent about strong illusionism, what they are saying is they're denying that that there is a what its likeness. And they parse that all sorts of different ways. But if they don't stick to that, then they're really just saying the same thing that most of us are already saying, which is, your introspection about your own beliefs could be largely misguided, but the idea that you're having those experiences cannot be misguided. So, with a little bit of caveating about the cogito, that like, we can't know anything about the nature of ourself, the I, in that situation, beyond the fact that it is the subject of experience. I agree with you that is a truth that cannot be denied. And so my job as someone who doesn't fully buy the panpsychist position is to explain why I think that it's not the best possible answer of the remaining answers. And so I guess I should lay out a little bit what I have in mind as an alternative, if not illusionism. Metaphysically, I lean towards, at this point, something like what's called substance monism, which I think throws a bit of a wrench into the discussion here a little bit, because we sort of assumed up to this point that, like, there's, the debate is between the substance dualists who think that there are physical substances and mental substances, and the panpsychists who think that there is just the material substance. But I guess I would say I'm not entirely sure how to parse the panpsychist position with regard to the nature of substance versus properties. So I would say that I'm a property dualist. I think there's one underlying substance, and this raises real problems. I'm not saying this is a solved position, but that there's this one underlying substance that is neither physical nor mental, but has in it both the potential for both physical and mental properties, and that in some parts of the universe it instantiates both mental and physical properties, and that in other parts of the universe it only instantiates physical properties. And that's where I think I diverge from your position. And then the question becomes, what is, like you said, what is my justification for believing that there are parts of the world that are conscious and parts of the world are sentient and parts of the world that are not? And my reasons are both practical and sort of theoretical, that if we're really genuinely talking about the nature of experience, like the subjective, what its likeness, I think we can give a really good evolutionary account of why such a thing arises in more complex organisms that have the capacity to interact with their environment, but it doesn't have any reason to arise in something like a rock. And so what then ends up happening, right, is I think we have a reason to say that the consciousness, the sentience that we care about, the sentience that gives us moral motivation towards human beings, that brought us around to have moral motivation towards animals, is not present in rocks and other parts of the universe. And if the panpsychist is willing to concede that, then that's good. But I think that means then that panpsychism is, as understood, is not the most functional solution to the hard problem, because we care about answering the hard problem in large part, I think, because we care about answering our ethical implications towards genuinely sentient beings, right? Peter Singer famously says, right, it's fine for me to kick a rock down the road because it's just a rock, right? But I think if we take the panpsychist view very seriously, we don't have a good reason to say it's okay for me to kick a rock down the road, because maybe that rock really is phenomenally conscious in a way that gives it a moral status. So I'm sorry, there was a lot that you'd put out there, so I'm going to try to cover a bunch of it. And then just in final, like coming back to Nagle, I think we generally agree that there's a divide between the subjective and the objective. You were describing science as being able to assess the objective, and I completely agree with you on all of this. And it's why I think the hard problem is kind of unresolvable, fully unresolvable. But I still think that an answer that doesn't sort of confusingly ascribe some level of experience, even the most basic level of experience, to electrons and rocks and things like that, is a better way to approach the problem. Well,
I can. A lot of what you said was compatible with panpsychism. Like at the beginning, talking about a sort of neutral monistic like conception of it's not exactly physical matter, it's not exactly mind, it's like some third thing. That's perfectly compatible with panpsychism. But where we diverge, I think, is I have a bias against strong emergence. So a sort of a position that's been called pan-proto-psychism, which sounded a little bit like what you were talking about, is really, I don't think, any better off than materialism, because it suffers from the same exact problems. One of the main things that leads people to panpsychism is a bias against strong emergence, where you kind of get something from nothing at some point along the chain of emergence. And it seems to me that pan-proto-psychism is still stuck with that problem. So I don't really get what how it's a solution. But you were talking about, as I took it, some of the moral implications of panpsychism. I mean, the reasons for accepting panpsychism is because it's an answer to the mind-body problem and the hard problem of consciousness. And it's the most because when I accept panpsychism, I'm not like changing the rules for accepting things. Like, I think it's the most parsimonious, like simplest account of what we know about the world. And Yeah, I mean, just by classical measures of, probability, I think it's the most likely, it's the best explanation that we have. And I think that is reason enough to accept it. And if it kind of throws a wrench in our morality, then too bad for our, morality. I mean, it seems a little bit like someone saying like, if God's not real, then we have no objective morality. And it's like, well, I don't know if that's true, but like, even if it is true, it's not exactly an argument for God.
Well, so I agree with you. It wouldn't be an argument, right? It wouldn't alone be an argument, is what I would say. But what I would try to argue is when we're assessing claims, we can assess them both from the purely theoretical side, like does this logically follow, and we can also assess, practically speaking, what are the implications of this, right? So, we don't want to argue backwards from we really care about animals, so let's just pretend that they're sentient when they're not, or something like that, right? That would be a fallacious kind of arguing, but it is important to understand that, if we do have good logical reason to say that animals are sentient, then it seems like moral reasons then necessarily follow about how we should treat them. And if what panpsychism is saying is that kind of sentience is fundamental to every level of the universe, then I do think that it should radically overhaul our moral obligations. But I so far haven't seen any panpsychists arguing for radical overhauls to how we treat atomic particles or something like that, which makes me then concerned that this is a purely theoretical solution to a purely theoretical problem about emergence. That is a real problem, and I want to talk about it some more in a second, but that as a theoretical solution, it's cut off, it feels like a lot of times, from the practical applications, the practical inferences that normally follow from claiming that something is sentient. And so in that way, it sort of obscures rather than illuminates the conversation, and then obscures downstream conversations like ethics. So I do think that is an important factor, if not a deciding factor.
I think that morality is ultimately about the experiences of conscious creatures. I think that morality ultimately bottoms out in positively or negatively valenced states of consciousness. That's sort of where the moral chain of justification ends. Mm-hmm. And
at least one of the main places it ends. I totally agree with you on that part. Yeah.
So it seems like if I'm saying, well, the fact that it's like something to be is fundamental and ubiquitous, and you think morality is about consciousness, doesn't that have radical moral implications? And the answer could still be no, because it's not just that it's conscious; it's that it has capacity for suffering and pleasure. The fact that it's like something to be is a necessary but not sufficient condition for moral salience. Where just because it's like something to be doesn't mean that you're free, to borrow Sam Harris's metaphor that I like a lot, the moral landscape. Just because it's like something to be doesn't mean that you're free to just travel anywhere along the moral landscape, up the to ascend peaks or descend valleys. It's a necessary condition. But
so I would argue there are members of the moral community that aren't sentient. So I would say,
but they have instrumental value, though.
Well, no, I would argue that even if it turned out that trees weren't sentient, they still have interests and still are have moral status, intrinsic, non-instrumental moral status.
So that's a question for another time. Even if trees are not conscious, they're intrinsically valuable. Even not counting, because I'm saying even if trees are not conscious at all, they're valuable because of
I also agree they're instrumentally valued, but I agree they're both instrumentally and I think they're non-instrumentally as well. Yes, that is my view at this moment in my time stream. But hang on. How does that? Okay, well then, how does that rock example help you? Because why couldn't you say the same thing about a rock? Well, the difference between the rock and the tree is that the rock the tree is as an organized living system has something it's like for it to flourish in a way that I don't necessarily believe that the rock has something it's like for it to flourish, even if it isn't sentient of its flourishing. That's how I would understand the distinction, in the sense that if I burn the tree down, it can't grow to be a big flourishing tree. But if I cut the rock in half, that's not preventing the rock from turning into a bigger, better rock.
I don't think I agree with that. I think that, so do you don't agree that morality is ultimately about conscious creatures?
I agree that one of the major foundations of morality is how we treat conscious creatures. I do not believe that ethics is exhausted by a conversation about how we treat conscious creatures, would be how I would put that. Okay. But I do think it is an incredibly important, efficient feature. Right? If you do have sentience, then you are necessarily a member of the moral community. So if something is being ascribed, and here's where here's where I would ask you, you asked me earlier, how do I know whether or not electrons are sentient? I feel like we can turn the question around and say, how do you know that electrons don't suffer if you think that they're sentient, right? We don't have any access to whether they suffer or not. So should we, any more than we have access to whether animals suffer or not? But if we're justified in believing that both of them are sentient, are we then justified in at least possibly, being concerned that both of them suffer?
Well, I don't really, I sort of put this in the same category of objection as just kind of anthropomorphizing consciousness, or thinking it means more than what I actually mean by consciousness. Like, a lot of times physicists or, other scientifically inclined people will say, well, we know panpsychism isn't true because we have, these fundamental particles that follow laws of physics, like, and the implication, being that, like, if panpsychism were true, then an electron would, like, have free will and just, like, violate the laws of physics all the time. And it's also funny because the person who I saw making that argument was Jerry Coyne, who famously does not believe in free will for humans. So I don't know why he's attributing it to, fundamental particles. But panpsychism doesn't. It's just the claim that it's like something to be, for an electron, not that it will, like, has free will or is able to suffer. Like, I think that complicated. I think that you need a brain to have the kind of experience that we're having. It's theoretically a lot less elegant and a lot more expensive. People typically think that panpsychism is theoretically expensive. I would say it's the exact opposite, because if you want to be a non-panpsychist and, a materialist, then you have to say that there's this non-experience involving stuff that, you don't know exists. And then you have to postulate these bridge laws. So, like I said, it's theoretically a lot more expensive.
So I understand the move that you're making with regard to the nature of the electron's sentience, and to me it feels like a move that is somewhat similar, though in the opposite direction, to what the illusionists do when they try to kind of have it both ways with regard to, we're not totally denying experience, but we're not saying that it's anything at all remotely like the experience that we think we are having in our normal day-to-day lives. And when we make that same move with regard to the electron, it seems like it deprives the panpsychist position of much significance, and that as a solution to the emergence problem, it just feels like it's a very, very, very narrowly tailored claim that's attempting to resolve a theoretical problem, but that is simultaneously, like, we're trying to keep it from bleeding over into any of the other problems that are associated with that particular problem, right? So when I claim that I'm sentient, and I'm not a reductionist about it, right, I'm saying that I have phenomenal states that have a causal role to play in the universe. They are caused in some way by, I'll go with, the underlying substance. I don't understand the causal relationship. That's the hard problem. If I had a solution to that, I'd be the richer person here. But if I don't have that, what I can at least say is, a solution to that problem needs to take into account all of the ways in which the subjective is important to our world. And it seems like in ascribing to electron subjectivity, but not any kind of subjectivity that we can have any knowledge about or discuss at all, then it feels like the burden of proof has shifted back towards the panpsychists to explain how this isn't just a kind of appeal to ignorance as a way to cover the emergence problem by saying there's this feature of these electrons that we theoretically infer, but can't infer anything else from. So that seems like a major concern. What do you think?
Well, I think that what panpsychists are trying to do is explain consciousness in terms of simpler forms of consciousness. So I don't really think it's a cop-out to say electrons have a simpler form of consciousness, like in the same, it's in the same, evolutionary progression as anything else. But yeah, it is based off theoretical concerns. I just don't really see why that's a strike against it. Like, I think that theoretical concerns, like, have driven all kinds of intellectual progress, including, not just in philosophy, but the acceptance of special relativity over Lorentzianism was due entirely to theoretical concerns. Like, they were empirically equivalent, but special relativity was, simpler.
It had implications, though, right? Like, what I'm saying is there's nothing wrong with being initially motivated by the theoretical concern about emergence. Emergence is a huge problem, and I completely concede that it's a problem, and it's why I lean towards substance monism, even though it also has a version of an emergence problem. But I think it's a better version of the emergence problem than trying to get, mental properties out of material properties solely. But I guess what I'm saying is if you're solving that theoretical problem while holding constant all the other implications of this move, then it seems like it's not fully resolving the whole cluster of problems that are tied together here.
Right.
So let me just make one more thing here, right? You said it has a more basic kind of consciousness and it's evolved, along similar evolutionary, and that we can put it on a spectrum with our own. But I guess I remain unconvinced that we shouldn't understand sentience as a localized phenomenon that doesn't exist anywhere in the universe and comes about as a result of things like evolution, and that I'm left like thinking, what is this basic? Is the electron sentient enough that it has anything like it is to be it? And if it doesn't, then it's not really sentient. And if it does, then it still seems like as basic as it could possibly be, it has some moral status. And that would involve, like I said, a major upheaval in our way of approaching the universe.
I also want to be a monist. My conception is entirely, monistic. Since we're wrapping up here, one of the main drivers to panpsychism is just that when you look at, when you actually zoom in to the emergence of, from physics to chemistry to biology, you take subatomic particles and then they emerge, into atoms into molecules and so on up the scale, all the way up to, societies and so on. I think that when because we know consciousness is real, and it's either like something to be or it's not. So at some point in that chain of emergence, it's going to have to just emerge. And it's easy to say that, but it's hard to know what that actually means. And any point just seems totally arbitrary. Like when you try to zoom in and say, here's where it emerged, it just seems like, okay, so this collection of molecules, which is almost identical to the one that preceded it, this binary switch was just flipped. And it really seems like you're adding this new ingredient that wasn't there before. And then when you add to that, how do we end up with this hard problem in the first place? Well, we ended up with it by postulating this Cartesian type of matter that we don't have any justification for. And I guess I would just say that, just to close, I would try to make the argument as clear as I could just by referencing an essay from Thomas Nagle called Panpsychism, where he kind of identifies the 4 premises that appear to lead to panpsychism. So it seems like every non-panpsychist is going to have to reject one of these 4. So I guess I'll just leave it there to make it clear where you'd have to disagree to not be a panpsychist. The first premise is just non-emergence, which is just what I've been talking about. There's no truly emergent phenomena in the world. Like everything that you can point to is reducible to the level beneath it. And when I talk about tables and chairs or biology or chemistry, these are just different ways of talking about matter. Like when you go from the subatomic particles to the atom, it's not like you've added a new ingredient. Atomness has been added in. It's just a different way of talking about clusters of protons, neutrons, and electrons. When you talk about a whirlpool to water to H2O molecules, you can easily follow the emergence of those things. Consciousness seems quite a bit different. And I think that it's not a coincidence that a lot of geneticists have been panpsychists, like the founder of epigenetics and the founder of population genetics. Because when you really swim around in that area where a lot of people suppose consciousness emerged, it really strikes you just how arbitrary it seems to say here and not there and so on. So I'll just rattle off the other 3 premises. The second one is realism, which is just that consciousness is real and not an illusion, which I think is pretty obvious. That's non-negotiable for me. The third one would be just that there's some irreducibly qualitative aspect to consciousness. And the fourth one would be material composition. So just that you're made of matter and nothing else. So those you'd have to reject one of those 4 in order to not be a panpsychist.
So I actually want to directly quote from Mortal Questions as well, because I think this panpsychism paper is really excellent. And it's a great example of Nagle sort of forcing us to come to terms with the subjective-objective divide in its many different forms. And he says it towards the end of that same paper. I therefore believe that panpsychism should be added to the current list of mutually incompatible and hopelessly unacceptable solutions to the mind-body problem, which is lovely philosophical shade throwing for, a way of saying, this doesn't work just like all the others. And that is partly where I land on the hard problem. I think there isn't a solution because there's no way to get rid of either the subjective or the objective, and there's no way to reduce one to the other. That doesn't lead me. I don't think we actually have to, and involves, rejecting maybe some of the ways that we understand the nature of substance as being materialistic in favor of neutral monism, right? I think there are ways that we can, that I agree with almost everything, and still think that we can say, and the sentience that we need to be talking about when we are trying to address all of the issues for us sentient beings is a kind of sentience that is not fully universal. It's a sentience that is located in certain kinds of entities, in certain kinds of situations. And even though we may not be able to, using science, perfectly understand the causal relationship between those things, I don't think we are therefore necessarily compelled to infer that some kind of sentience exists at the very bottom levels. And I also want to point out, in this paper, Panpsychism, Nagle lays out what I haven't even talked about as an objection, but which is considered, I think, the most commonly lobbed objection, which is the combination problem of how is it that sentient electron, or electron sentience comes together to create the kind of sentience that we have as complex organisms. I'm not saying there isn't a solution to that problem. I just, my response would be, I fully agree that there's a huge problem here. I remain unconvinced that we're compelled towards the panpsychist position, but I consider it a more plausible position to be coerced towards than the illusionist position.
I don't know what the fuck you guys were talking about that whole time. That was so over my head.
Neither do we. That's the whole point.
No, really. No, you do, though. You do. That was mind-blowing. My IPS address on Google was lighting up like a strobe light the whole time you're talking, because I'm just like, what is this? What is this? What is it? Fantastic. Oh, my God. I'm rock hard. Thank you. I'm confused, but rock hard. That's the way I like to keep it. Thanks. Like, that was awesome. Aaron Rabinowitz, from Embrace the Void and Philosophers in Space. Emerson Green, Counter Apologetics and Walden Pod. Gentlemen, thank you so much for literally blowing my mind today. Thank you guys so much for spending your time with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was so much fun.
Yeah, likewise. And Emerson, I think great job laying out the position. I can't say enough that the people who are needlessly dunking on Twitter on panpsychism need to knock it the fuck off, because you don't understand the hard problem enough if you really think this is this easy.